Hit subscribe and the bell icon to discover amazing historical stories with us every week. The carriage wheels had barely stopped grinding against the brick-paved path when I heard the familiar shuffle of feet rushing toward the gates. From my seat inside the stuffy confines of the wooden conveyance, I could already picture the figure approaching, that stocky, red-haired brute of a man who served as my overseer. 32 years had passed since I'd purchased him at the meat market in Rome, and still the sight of him filled me with the same mixture of disgust and pragmatic satisfaction that had driven me to pay 300 denarii for what others had dismissed as a worthless beast. The door of the carriage swung open with its characteristic creak, and there he stood, Rufus. His squat frame blocked the late afternoon sun, casting shadows across my weathered face. The man possessed no neck to speak of. His oversized head seemed to rest directly upon his shoulders, giving him the appearance of some mythological creature that had wandered down from the hills of Latium. His arms, thick as tree trunks and covered in coarse red hair, reached out to assist me from the carriage, but I recoiled instinctively from his touch. "By the gods," he mumbled in his gravelly voice, his Latin still tinged with the accent of his barbarian origins. "Finally, master has come to us." Our master had completely forgotten about us. "Silence," I commanded sharply, stepping down from the carriage unaided. The familiar weight of authority settled upon my shoulders as my feet touched the solid ground of my estate. This land, these buildings, these people, all of it belonged to me, Marcus Porcius Cato, and I took that responsibility more seriously than any senator's duty I had ever shouldered in the Forum. Here, in this rural corner of the Roman countryside, I was not merely a politician or orator, but the absolute master of a world that fed the great city and enriched the republic. I strode through the gates with purposeful steps, my hobnailed sandals clicking against the brick pathway I had ordered laid down 3 summers prior. The sound echoed off the walls of the modest wooden buildings that comprised my villa. Some might call it humble. Indeed, my neighbors had long since replaced their ancestral homes with grand stone structures, adorned with imported marble columns and elaborate frescoes, but I took pride in the simplicity of my dwelling. It is not the house that makes the man dear, but what is within it, I often reminded visitors who raised their eyebrows at my unpretentious architecture. The main house before me stood as a testament to Roman practicality over Greek ostentation. Its timber frame had weathered countless seasons, growing darker and more distinguished with age. The roof tiles, baked in the kilns of nearby workshops, bore the patina of decades of sun and rain. This was perhaps the last wooden villa of any significance in the district, but I refused to follow the fashionable trends that emptied purses while adding nothing to productivity. Every denarius I saved on decorative folly was a denarius that could be invested in improving my agricultural operations, purchasing better breeding stock, or expanding my olive groves. As I ducked my head to pass through the low doorframe, another mark of the building's age and humble origins, the sense of my household immediately assaulted my senses. The air in the semi-dark atrium was heavy with the aromas of garlic and black pepper, creating an atmosphere that reminded me more of a vegetable market than a Roman gentleman's residence. In the corner, leather sacks containing the season's spice harvest were stacked in careful piles, their contents representing months of careful cultivation and harvest. I made my way to my writing chair, a simple but sturdy piece of furniture that had served me faithfully for 2 decades. From this seat, I had composed letters to fellow senators, calculated the profits from olive oil sales, and planned the seasonal rotations of my crops. It was here that I conducted the business of being a landowner, a role that required as much skill and attention as any political office. Rufus followed me inside, his heavy footsteps disturbing the dust motes that danced in the shafts of light filtering through the small windows. I could sense his nervousness. Though I had not yet revealed the true purpose of my unexpected visit, recent intelligence had reached me in Rome. Whispers of irregularities in the management of my estate, suggestions that my trusted overseer had been dipping his fingers into affairs that were none of his concern. The time had come to separate truth from rumor, and, if necessary, to administer the harsh justice that kept a large agricultural enterprise functioning efficiently. The Roman economy in our age depended upon the proper management of such estates. We who owned land and slaves were the backbone of the republic's prosperity. Our wheat fed the urban masses. Our wine graced the tables of patricians and plebeians alike, and our olive oil lit the lamps that burned in homes from Britain to Egypt. The responsibility was not one I took lightly, nor was it one that allowed for sentiment or weakness in dealing with those who would betray their master's trust. As I settled into my chair and gestured for Rufus to begin his report, I reflected on the changes I had witnessed in my lifetime. When I was young, Rome was still a city-state struggling for dominance in Italy. Now we ruled the Mediterranean, and the wealth flowing into Roman coffers had transformed not just our politics, but our very society. Luxury and corruption walked hand in hand through the streets of the capital. But here, on my estate, I maintained the old values that had made Rome great: discipline, frugality, and the hard work that built empires. Rufus cleared his throat and began his seasonal report, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had delivered such accounts countless times before. I listened with the attention of a general receiving intelligence from the battlefield, for in many ways, that is precisely what this was: a war against waste, inefficiency, and the natural tendency of all things to slide toward chaos without firm guidance. "The grain harvest has been completed, master," he began, his thick fingers gesturing toward the storage buildings visible through the open doorway. "All wheat has been cut and the grain stored in the granaries. The vintage, however," he paused, and I detected the hesitation that always preceded unwelcome news. "The grapes did not yield well this season, only 20 amphorae of new wine." 20 amphorae! In a good year, my vineyards produced 3 times that amount. I made a mental note to examine the vines personally before my departure. Poor harvests could result from many factors: disease, improper pruning, inadequate irrigation, or simple neglect. Given the suspicions that had brought me here, I suspected the latter. "Oil production?" I inquired, maintaining the neutral tone that had served me well in both the Senate and the marketplace. 10 amphorae of olive oil. The vinegar for the slaves has been prepared according to your instructions. Currently, the chained workers are digging new irrigation channels, while the other slaves are cleaning the livestock yards. We transport the manure directly to the fields as you ordered. The mention of chained workers, the vincti, reminded me of one of the harsh realities of Roman agriculture. These were not ordinary slaves. but men who had committed crimes or shown persistent disobedience. They worked in fetters, lived in the underground prison we called the ergastulum, and represented the iron fist within the velvet glove of Roman civilization. Yet even these most desperate of men served the Republic's needs, their labor contributing to the abundance that kept our cities fed and our armies supplied. "Tell me about the breeding stock," I continued, mentally calculating the potential profits from livestock sales. 5 bull calves born this season, 6 ewe lambs, 40 piglets. Rufus's scarred hands counted off the numbers with the precision of a merchant at market. As for the 2-legged stock, spring brought us 9 girls and 6 boys. 2 boys died in their first month, as often happens. In total, we now have 40 young ones below working age. The casual mention of infant mortality stirred no emotion in me. Death was as common as sunrise in our world. Particularly among slave children, the weak did not survive to burden their masters with unproductive mouths to feed, while the strong grew to become valuable assets. This was the natural order that had built Rome's dominion over the known world. "Are there any sick among the workers?" I asked, knowing that disease could spread rapidly through crowded slave quarters and devastate a workforce in a matter of days. "Why should they be sick?" Rufus replied after a moment's pause that I found telling. "The work is reasonable, the food is good." His defensive tone suggested otherwise, but I reserved judgment for my personal inspection. A good overseer prevented sickness through proper nutrition and sanitation. A lazy or corrupt one allowed conditions to deteriorate until valuable human property was lost to preventable ailments. "Do fortune-tellers come around the estate?" I asked, shifting to a topic that had long concerned me. These wandering charlatans preyed upon the superstitions of slaves and freedmen, often serving as conduits for seditious ideas or simply as thieves who scouted wealthy properties for future robbery. "One came by," Rufus admitted, "but he forgot the road and told others to forget it too." "What did you do to him?" I pressed, sensing there was more to this tale. "I did nothing, but Rex bit him a little." Rex was my guard dog, a massive mastiff whose loyalty was matched only by his ferocity. While I appreciated his protective instincts, I could not condone setting dogs upon human beings, regardless of their social station. "How can you set dogs on people?" I demanded, allowing some of my displeasure to show. "You should have told him with words, 'Go away while you're still whole and healthy.'" "I did tell him that, master, but he didn't understand, so I released Rex." The crude logic was typical of Rufus. Direct, effective, but lacking the sophistication that distinguished a Roman citizen from a barbarian. Still, I had not hired him for his diplomatic skills, but for his ability to extract maximum productivity from a large and diverse workforce. "If I listen to you, it seems I need never visit at all. Is that not so?" I challenged him. Rufus shook his massive head vigorously. "How could you not visit? A villa without the master's eye is an orphan." I tried my best, but perhaps I overlooked something. "Indeed, that is exactly why I have come. Let us take a walk." His question came with the oily tone I had learned to associate with his attempts at flattery. "Where shall we go, master?" I considered the route carefully. During my previous visit 6 months earlier, I had begun my inspection with the livestock yards, then proceeded to examine the wine cellars and grain storage facilities. Today, I felt compelled to follow an unusual path. one that might reveal the secrets I suspected Rufus was hiding from me. The Roman villa system that I had perfected over decades of careful management was a complex organism. Like the Republic itself, it functioned through a careful balance of authority, incentive, and punishment. Every slave, from the youngest child to the most skilled craftsman, had a role to play in the greater enterprise. The overseer served as my representative, wielding power over hundreds of lives while remaining accountable to me for every aspect of production and profit. My agricultural treatise, De Agricultura, which I had been composing during quiet evenings in Rome, would someday preserve these methods for future generations. In it, I planned to detail not just the technical aspects of farming, the proper seasons for planting, the care of livestock, the production of wine and oil, but also the management principles that made large-scale agriculture profitable. Future Romans would thank me for codifying the wisdom that had transformed our nation from a collection of hill tribes into the master of the Mediterranean world. "Let us begin with the two-legged young stock," I announced, watching carefully for Rufus's reaction. The flicker of alarm that crossed his weathered features told me more than any formal report could have revealed. Whatever secrets this estate harbored, they were connected to the most vulnerable members of my property, the slave children whose proper development represented a significant investment in my future prosperity. As we walked toward the area where the youngest slaves were housed, I reflected on the changes that had swept through Roman society during my lifetime. The conquest of Greece had brought a flood of educated slaves into our households. Teachers, doctors, artisans, whose skills far exceeded those of their masters. This influx of talent had transformed Roman culture, but it had also introduced corrupting influences that threatened our traditional values. Greek luxury, Greek philosophy, Greek moral laxity. All of these foreign elements weakened the stern virtues that had made Rome great. The ancient oak tree that dominated the slave quarters had witnessed more than a century of human activity on this estate. Its gnarled branches provided shade for generations of workers, and beneath its spreading canopy, I now observed a scene that both amused and disturbed me. Small children, naked and grimy from their play in the dust, crawled about like young animals, their carefree movements a stark contrast to the regimented lives they would soon be forced to adopt. An elderly slave woman, her back bent with decades of labor, had been dozing against the tree's massive trunk until our approaching footsteps roused her. Recognizing my presence with the instinctive fear that all slaves maintain toward their masters, she scrambled to her feet and began gathering her scattered charges. Some she pulled by their tiny hands, others she swatted on their bare bottoms, herding them with the efficiency born of long practice. To the right, on a patch of ground worn smooth by countless small feet, older boys engaged in the games of childhood. Some played at leapfrog, their laughter echoing off the villa walls, while others threw coins in what I recognized as an ancient gambling game. The sight stirred memories of my own youth, when I too had participated in such simple pleasures, before duty and ambition had claimed my life entirely. I frowned at the scene before me. These children represented a significant investment, the future workforce that would maintain my estate's productivity for decades to come. Yet here they were, wasting precious daylight hours in idle pursuits when they could be learning skills that would make them more valuable. They jump about without purpose, I muttered through clenched teeth, my disapproval evident in every syllable. Rufus, sensing my displeasure, rushed to defend his management practices. "What work could there be for them now, master? In autumn, they gather the fallen grain from the harvest. In spring, when the livestock feed runs low, they will strip leaves for fodder, for now they are growing and gaining strength." His explanation was reasonable, but it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the principles that governed successful enterprise. Time was the most precious commodity any master possessed. Every moment spent in unproductive activity was a moment that could have been invested in training, learning, or contributing to the estate's prosperity. The Roman Republic had not conquered the world by allowing its citizens to idle away their youth in purposeless play. I had seen enough of the children's activities. More pressing matters demanded my attention, and the growing suspicion that had brought me here required investigation of areas where an overseer's corruption would be most likely to hide. "Now we go to the ergastulum," I announced sharply, cutting off Rufus's continued justifications. The underground slave prison was a place I actively avoided during my normal visits to the estate. The stench, the gloom, the constant reminders of human degradation, all of these offended my sensibilities as a Roman gentleman, but I had learned through long experience that overseers hid their sins in the ergastulum, knowing that their masters rarely descended into that netherworld of chains and despair. In preparation for this distasteful necessity, I had brought with me a small wooden container of aromatic ointment, a mixture of roses and expensive spices that would help mask the offensive odors I expected to encounter. Drawing the container from the sewn pocket of my tunic, I carefully applied the ointment to my upper lip, creating a fragrant barrier against the assault on my senses that awaited below. Overseers hide their crimes in the ergastulum, I thought to myself as we approached the low, almost invisible structure that housed my estate's most desperate slaves. From a distance, the ergastulum barely registered as a building at all. Its walls rose only 2 cubits above ground level, while its flat roof served the dual purpose of providing Rufus with a convenient place to dry the turnips and cabbages that formed the primary diet of the chained workers. The structure's deliberate concealment reflected Roman attitudes toward the human cargo it contained, necessary for agricultural productivity, but shameful enough to hide from casual observation. "This way, master," Rufus said, his voice carrying a nervousness that confirmed my suspicions about what we would find below. We turned left and approached the stone steps that led down into the subterranean chambers. Despite the aromatic preparation I had made, the odors of decay and human waste still managed to assault my nostrils. The smell spoke of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and the kind of neglect that transformed valuable human property into worthless, disease-ridden burdens. I pinched my nostrils shut with my fingers and descended bravely into the depth. The light filtering through the barred windows near the ceiling barely illuminated the long, 2-tiered sleeping platforms that lined the underground chamber. The lower level, as was proper, stood empty. The chained workers were laboring in the irrigation ditches that had collapsed after the recent rains. From a corner of the upper platform, however, I could hear the weak groaning of someone in obvious distress. Straining my eyes in the dim light, I could barely make out a human form huddled beneath what appeared to be rags. The figure's face remained hidden, but the labored breathing and occasional moans suggested serious injury or illness, conditions that represented a direct threat to my investment in this estate's workforce. "Who is that?" I demanded, my voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect in the Roman Senate. "Xanthus, the teacher," Rufus replied, his voice trembling with an emotion I could not immediately identify. "Why is he here when his place is at the mill?" I pressed, already suspecting the answer. "I beat him a little," the overseer admitted. The casual admission of violence against a valuable slave filled me with rage. Teachers were among the most expensive and useful slaves one could own. A good Greek tutor could command prices of 2,000 denarii or more in the markets of Rome. They provided education for the children of the household, served as scribes and accountants, and added intellectual refinement to any estate fortunate enough to possess them. To find such a valuable asset reduced to a broken figure moaning in the ergastulum represented both a financial disaster and a management catastrophe. "Come," I ordered, unable to bear another moment in that fetid underground chamber. I rushed up the stone steps, and only at ground level allowed myself to breathe deeply of the clean air. The contrast between the fresh breeze carrying the scents of ripening fruit and growing grain, and the oppressive atmosphere of human misery below, served as a stark reminder of the dual nature of Roman civilization. Beautiful and productive above ground, brutal and exploitative in its hidden foundations. "Beat him!" I repeated, staring at the massive, hairy fists that Rufus used to enforce his authority. "I can imagine how that turned out with you." The overseer's physical power was undeniable. Those fists could probably kill a man with a single blow, but brute force was a crude tool for managing valuable human resources. A skilled administrator used incentives, punishments, and psychological pressure to maintain discipline, reserving physical violence for only the most extreme circumstances. "He was guilty," Rufus croaked, hanging his head as low as his thick neck would allow. His defensive response revealed the fundamental problem with hiring barbarian slaves as overseers. They possessed the strength and ruthlessness necessary to control large workforces, but they lacked the sophistication to distinguish between correction and destruction. A Roman citizen would understand the economic implications of damaging valuable property. A former Gaul or German saw only the immediate satisfaction of asserting dominance through violence. What do you think about this historical event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I stared at Rufus with the cold fury that had once silenced opposing senators in the forum. The man before me represented everything I despised about the corruption that had begun to seep into Roman society. The substitution of brute force for intelligent management, the waste of valuable resources through ignorance and poor judgment. "What did I tell you?" I demanded, my voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Do not give free rein to your fists. If punishment is necessary, it is better to use the whip." The distinction was crucial, though it might seem subtle to those unfamiliar with the proper management of slave labor. Flogging with a whip, while painful and degrading, was a controlled punishment that left valuable slaves capable of returning to productive work. The savage beating administered by Rufus's massive fists could easily result in permanent disability or death, outcomes that transformed assets into liabilities. "I am guilty. I could not restrain myself," he whimpered, his voice taking on the pathetic tone of a child caught in mischief. "Stop repeating yourself like a parrot," I snapped, "always saying guilty, guilty. Here's what I'll do. I'll deduct the value of this slave from your earnings. Then you'll understand." The threat of financial consequences achieved what moral arguments could not. Rufus immediately dropped to his knees, his earlier defiance replaced by desperate pleading. "Don't ruin me, master. My wife's health is weak. My children are small." The mention of his family was calculated to evoke sympathy, but I had learned through decades of experience that sentimentality had no place in successful estate management. Roman agriculture operated on principles as rigid as military discipline: rewards for excellence, punishment for failure, and the absolute necessity of maintaining profitability in a competitive marketplace. "Get up," I ordered, my mind already working toward a solution that might salvage some value from this disaster. "I have an idea. The teacher is obviously finished for heavy labor, as I can see. You will assign him to the young slaves. Let him teach them Greek language and writing." Rufus gaped at me in astonishment, his limited intelligence struggling to comprehend the wisdom of my decision. "But why do they need to read and write?" His question revealed the fundamental difference between a barbarian slave's perspective and a Roman citizen's strategic thinking. Rufus saw only the immediate, strong backs for heavy labor, submission to authority, the simple relationship between master and beast of burden. I, however, understood the evolving nature of Roman society and the premium placed on educated slaves in contemporary markets. "Fool," I replied with barely concealed contempt. "An intelligent slave now commands premium prices. They sell for twice the value of ordinary workers, and one who knows Greek is nearly priceless. Do you understand?" The economics of slave trading had changed dramatically during my lifetime. In the early days of Roman expansion, simple agricultural laborers from conquered territories flooded our markets, their value determined primarily by physical strength and endurance. But as our empire expanded into the educated regions of the Mediterranean, Greece, Egypt, Asia Minor, a new category of human merchandise had emerged. Greek tutors, in particular, had become status symbols among wealthy Romans. The ability to speak Greek fluently marked a household as sophisticated and cultured. Greek literature, philosophy, and rhetoric were increasingly seen as essential components of a proper Roman education. A slave who could teach these subjects to the children of a prominent family might live in comfort, enjoy intellectual stimulation, and even earn manumission as a reward for faithful service. Rufus nodded eagerly, finally grasping the financial implications of my decision. The transformation from confusion to enthusiastic agreement was almost comical, like watching a dim-witted child suddenly understand a simple mathematical concept. "I will return in the spring to check on their progress," I continued, pressing home the importance of this new arrangement. "Tell the teacher exactly what I expect." "Where to now?" Rufus asked, his confidence partially restored by the resolution of his crisis. "To the livestock yards?" I replied. But even as I spoke, the sound of wheels and hooves interrupted our conversation. A cart pulled by a pair of mules had arrived at my estate's main gate, stopping beside my own carriage where my driver was tending to the horses. The vehicle's design and the quality of its draft animals suggested a merchant of moderate means, someone engaged in regional trade rather than the grand commercial ventures that connected Rome to the farthest corners of the empire. "What guest is this?" I demanded, noting with growing suspicion the way Rufus had suddenly gone pale. The overseer's silence was more revealing than any confession could have been. His weathered face had drained of all color, taking on the sickly white appearance of chalk. The dramatic change in his demeanor confirmed that this unexpected visitor was somehow connected to the corruption I had come to investigate. "Answer me. Who is this? Speak," I commanded. But Rufus only trembled in response. Have you swallowed your tongue? Or what? Very well, stay here. I'll find out for myself. I strode toward the gate with the purposeful gait that had once carried me across the battlefields of Spain and through the corridors of political power in Rome. Whatever scheme my overseer had been conducting, it was about to be exposed to the harsh light of investigation. Beyond the estate walls, I came face to face with a pleasant-looking young man wearing a leather apron over his tunic. His appearance suggested an artisan or skilled craftsman, the kind of Roman citizen who formed the backbone of our republic's growing commercial economy. His face bore the honest expression of someone engaged in legitimate trade, which made his presence here all the more suspicious, given Rufus's obvious guilt. "Whose man are you?" I asked, employing the traditional greeting that established social relationships in our stratified society. "I work for Philemon. He maintains a sandal workshop in Cumae," the young man replied respectfully, recognizing my status as a person of authority. Cumae was an ancient Greek colony on the Campanian coast, now thoroughly Romanized and integrated into our economic system. The city was known for its skilled craftsmen and served as a regional center for trade in leather goods, pottery, and other manufactured items. A sandal maker from Cumae would have legitimate reasons to seek high-quality hides from rural estates like mine. "What business brings you here?" I continued, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "The overseer sold me a bull's hide. I already gave him a down payment. He sent it to be scraped clean by his slaves." The young merchant's explanation confirmed my worst fears about Rufus's activities. The sale of livestock hides was indeed within an overseer's legitimate authority. Such transactions were routine parts of estate management, but the secrecy surrounding this particular deal, combined with Rufus's obvious terror at being discovered, suggested that the profits from this sale had been diverted into his personal coffers rather than properly recorded in my accounts. "How much?" I asked, reaching for the leather purse that hung from my belt. "1 denarius, he replied. I extracted a silver coin from my purse and placed it in the young man's calloused palm. "Take this, and avoid doing business with this overseer in the future, or you'll end up losing money." The merchant accepted the coin gratefully, recognizing both my generosity and the implicit warning about my estate's management problems. After exchanging polite farewells, he climbed back onto his cart, whistled sharply to his mules, and departed with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making his living on the roads between rural estates and urban markets. I turned back toward where Rufus waited, knowing that the time had come for the final confrontation between master and servant, between Roman justice and barbarian corruption. I beckoned Rufus with a gesture that carried all the authority of Roman law and tradition. The corrupt overseer approached with unsteady steps. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. When he reached me, his legs gave way and he collapsed to the ground, pressing desperate kisses to my sandaled feet in the time-honored gesture of abject submission. The sight of this powerful man reduced to groveling reminded me of the fundamental truth that governed all relationships in our society: the absolute power of the master over his property, whether that property consisted of land, livestock, or human beings. This power carried with it tremendous responsibility, for the prosperity of Rome itself depended upon the efficient management of the agricultural estates that fed our growing population and provided the wealth that funded our armies. "You are a thief," I declared, nudging him away with my foot. Turning to address my carriage driver, I pronounced the sentence that would restore proper order to my estate. "Take this man to the mill and chain him to the grinding wheel. There is one vacant position there." The mill was where my most troublesome slaves spent their final productive years, grinding grain through the endless rotation of the massive stone wheels. It was back-breaking labor that consumed a man's strength within a few seasons, but it served both as punishment for serious crimes and as a means of extracting final value from slaves who could no longer perform more skilled work. "Have mercy," Rufus wailed, writhing on the ground like a serpent. "My wife has weak health. What will become of my twins?" His desperate appeals to my compassion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he had created through his own greed and dishonesty. The time for mercy had passed when he chose to steal from his master, to beat valuable slaves nearly to death, and to conduct unauthorized business transactions for his own profit. "Why do you concern yourself with your wife?" I asked coldly. "She will now be the wife of the overseer I send to replace you." This was standard practice in Roman estate management. When an overseer was removed for cause, his replacement typically inherited his predecessor's domestic arrangements along with his professional responsibilities. The woman would continue to perform her household duties, while any children would remain on the estate as part of my slave population. It was an efficient system that prevented the disruption of established routines, while ensuring that valuable human resources were not wasted through unnecessary separations. I turned back to my driver, who had been waiting patiently for his instructions. "I will return to Rome myself," I announced. "You will serve as temporary overseer until I can send a permanent replacement. After you chain this criminal to the mill wheel, release the teacher Xanthus from the ergastulum. Put him in charge of teaching the boys Greek language and letters." The irony was not lost on me. The slave whom Rufus had brutally beaten would now assume a position of authority over the estate's most precious resource. Its future generation of workers. Xanthus, despite his current condition, possessed knowledge that could multiply the value of every child under his instruction. In the competitive markets of the modern world, educated slaves commanded premium prices that could fund additional land purchases, improved equipment, and expanded agricultural operations. As I climbed onto the driver's bench of my carriage, preparing to assume control of the reins, I delivered my final instructions to the man who had once been my trusted overseer. "Take his children to join the other young slaves." These words sealed Rufus's fate and demonstrated the inexorable logic of Roman justice. His corruption had not only cost him his position and freedom, but had also condemned his children to the same servitude he had sought to escape through theft. The twins would grow up alongside the other slave children, learning the same lessons in obedience and productivity that would make them valuable assets to my estate. The transformation from free family man to chained mill worker represented one of the fundamental realities of our social system. In Rome, status was never permanently fixed. Fortune's wheel could elevate a slave to wealth and influence, or cast down a free man into bondage and misery. What mattered was not one's birth or temporary position, but one's character, and the choices made when faced with moral challenges. As I took up the leather reins and prepared to guide my horses back toward the capital, I reflected on the day's discoveries and the actions I had taken to address them. The estate would continue to function, perhaps more efficiently than before. The corrupt overseer had been removed and would serve as an example to his replacement. The valuable teacher would recover from his injuries and begin the important work of educating the next generation of slaves. Most importantly, the principles that had made Rome great, justice, discipline, and the efficient use of resources, had been upheld and reinforced. The sun was beginning to set as my carriage wheels rolled back onto the stone-paved road that led to Rome. Behind me, I left an estate restored to proper order, its human and material resources organized for maximum productivity. Ahead lay the eternal city, where senators debated the fate of nations, and where the wealth generated by estates like mine funded the legions that extended Roman civilization to the farthest corners of the known world. The day's work was complete, but the larger task of maintaining Roman greatness continued. Every properly managed estate, every disciplined slave, every denarius of honest profit contributed to the strength of the Republic. My agricultural treatise would preserve these lessons for future generations, ensuring that the wisdom I had gained through decades of experience would survive to guide Roman landowners long after my own bones had crumbled to dust. In the gathering twilight, I urged my horses to greater speed, eager to return to the political battles that awaited me in the Senate. The problems of rural estate management had been solved through the application of traditional Roman virtues: stern justice tempered by practical wisdom, the subordination of immediate sentiment to long-term benefit, and the unwavering commitment to the principles that had elevated a small Italian city-state to mastery over the Mediterranean world. The rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on stone provided a fitting accompaniment to my thoughts as I considered the future of Roman agriculture and society. Changes were coming. I could sense them in the increasing sophistication of slave markets, in the growing demand for educated household staff, in the complex economic relationships that now connected rural estates to urban centers and distant provinces. But whatever transformations lay ahead, they would be guided by the eternal principles that had made Rome great: discipline, efficiency, and the proper exercise of authority in service of the common good. The journey back to Rome provided ample time for reflection on the day's events and their broader implications for the Roman Republic's agricultural foundations. As my horses maintained their steady pace along the well-maintained road that connected rural estates to the capital, I found myself contemplating the complex web of relationships that made our civilization possible. The corruption I had uncovered and eliminated at my estate was merely a single example of the challenges facing Roman landowners throughout the peninsula. As our republic expanded its dominion over new territories, the traditional bonds that had once held Roman society together were being strained by unprecedented wealth and cultural influences from conquered peoples. The simple virtues that had elevated Rome from a collection of hill tribes to the master of the Mediterranean were under constant assault from Greek luxury, Eastern mysticism, and the moral laxity that inevitably accompanied military success. My agricultural treatise, De Agricultura, would serve as more than a manual for farming techniques. It would preserve the fundamental principles that had made Roman agriculture the most productive in the known world. Future generations would need to understand not just the practical aspects of crop rotation and livestock breeding, but also the management philosophy that transformed potentially rebellious slaves into productive workers and chaotic rural landscapes into ordered, profitable enterprises. The case of Xanthus, the Greek teacher whom I had rescued from Rufus's brutal treatment, exemplified both the opportunities and dangers inherent in Rome's expanding empire. Greek slaves brought invaluable skills in education, medicine, and administration that enhanced the sophistication of Roman households, yet they also imported cultural attitudes that challenged traditional Roman values. Greek philosophy questioned the foundations of authority. Greek literature celebrated individual expression over collective duty, and Greek social customs undermined the stern discipline that Roman fathers exercised over their families. My decision to transform Xanthus from a broken victim into an educator of slave children represented a practical solution to this cultural tension. By channeling his Greek knowledge toward the production of more valuable Roman slaves, I had turned a potential source of subversion into an instrument of economic advancement. The children under his instruction would learn Greek language and letters, not to question Roman authority, but to serve it more effectively. The evening air carried the familiar sense of the Roman countryside. Ripening grain, olive trees heavy with fruit, and the smoke from countless villa hearths where families gathered for their evening meals. This fertile landscape, dotted with well-managed estates like my own, formed the economic foundation that supported our urban population and funded our military expeditions. Every properly cultivated field, every efficiently managed slave workforce, every honest profit contributed to the strength that allowed Roman legions to march triumphantly across continents. As the walls of Rome appeared on the horizon, their massive stones glowing golden in the setting sun, I felt the familiar mixture of pride and concern that the city always inspired in me. Within those walls lived nearly 1 million souls, citizens and slaves, patricians and plebeians, Romans born and foreigners seeking opportunity in the world's greatest metropolis. The diversity that made Rome strong also threatened to dilute the traditional values that had created our greatness. In the Forum, I would soon face senators who had never managed an agricultural estate, who had never been forced to make the hard decisions that kept workers productive and enterprises profitable. These men, many of them descended from families enriched by military conquest or commercial speculation, possessed theoretical knowledge but lacked practical understanding of the foundations upon which Roman prosperity rested. They could debate the finer points of Greek philosophy or quote extensively from imported literature, but few had ever risen before dawn to inspect grain stores or calculate the optimal breeding ratios for livestock herds. The contrast between urban sophistication and rural practicality had become one of the defining tensions of contemporary Roman society. City dwellers enjoyed the luxury goods that flowed into Rome from across the empire. Silk from China, spices from India, precious metals from Spain, but they rarely considered the agricultural surpluses that made such imports possible. My estate, and thousands like it throughout Italy, generated the wealth that purchased exotic luxuries and maintained the legions that protected trade routes from Britain to Egypt. My horse's hooves echoed off the stone pavement as we approached the city gates. The guards recognized me immediately. My reputation as both senator and successful landowner preceded me in most quarters of Rome. Their respectful salutes reminded me that despite the challenges facing our republic, the fundamental institutions that had built our greatness remained intact. Roman law still governed disputes between citizens. Roman discipline still maintained order in our armies, and Roman agricultural methods still produced the abundance that fed our growing population. The streets of the capital buzzed with evening activity as merchants closed their shops, craftsmen completed their daily tasks, and families prepared for the night ahead. Slaves hurried through the thoroughfares carrying torches to light their master's way, while free citizens gathered in taverns to discuss the day's political developments. The complex hierarchy that organized this urban community reflected the same principles I applied in managing my rural estate: clear lines of authority, appropriate rewards for faithful service, and swift punishment for those who violated the established order. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in the Senate, where I would continue my lifelong battle against the corrupting influences that threatened Roman values. Colleagues would propose legislation influenced by Greek theories of governance, Eastern concepts of luxury, or simply the short-sighted pursuit of immediate political advantage. My voice would rise in opposition, defending the traditions that had elevated Rome to unprecedented greatness, and warning against innovations that might weaken our republic's foundations. But tonight, I would rest in the satisfaction of a day's work well done. My estate had been cleansed of corruption, its human resources reorganized for maximum productivity, and its future secured through proper management principles. The lessons learned during this investigation would inform my agricultural writings and provide concrete examples of the challenges facing Roman landowners throughout the peninsula. Most importantly, the stern justice I had administered would serve as a warning to other overseers who might be tempted to betray their master's trust. As I guided my horses through the familiar streets toward my city residence, I reflected on the continuity that connected my roles as senator, landowner, and guardian of Roman traditions. Each responsibility reinforced the others. My agricultural experience informed my political positions. My senatorial dignity enhanced my authority over rural workers, and my commitment to traditional values guided both my public and private decisions. This integration of different aspects of Roman life had been the key to my success, and would continue to guide my efforts to preserve the Republic's greatness for future generations. The familiar comfort of my Roman residence welcomed me as I finally concluded the long day that had begun with suspicions and ended with the restoration of proper order to my rural estate. The oil lamps cast their warm glow across the modest but well-appointed rooms that reflected my philosophy of functional elegance over ostentatious display. Here, surrounded by the practical luxuries that honest profits had purchased, I could contemplate the broader implications of the day's events. The corruption of Rufus represented more than a simple case of employee dishonesty. It symbolized the moral decay that threatened to undermine the very foundations of Roman greatness. Throughout our expanding empire, similar scenes were undoubtedly playing out as traditional values clashed with the temptations of unprecedented wealth and cultural confusion. The challenge facing our generation was to maintain the discipline and integrity that had built Rome's dominion while adapting to the complex realities of governing a Mediterranean empire. My slave Gaius, a young man of Greek origin whom I had purchased several years earlier, approached with the respectful demeanor that marked a properly trained household servant. His education, superior to that of many free Roman citizens, enabled him to assist with my correspondence and serve as a living example of the potential value that wise investment in human resources could yield. Unlike the situation with Xanthus at my villa, Gaius had been integrated into my household through careful management, rather than rescued from crisis. "Master," he said in perfectly accented Latin, "shall I prepare your writing materials? You mentioned wishing to work on your agricultural treatise this evening." The reminder of my literary project brought my thoughts full circle to the events I had witnessed at the villa. The transformation of Xanthus from broken victim to teacher of slave children would provide an excellent case study for future readers of De Agricultura. The incident demonstrated how apparent disasters could be converted into opportunities through creative problem-solving and adherence to sound management principles. "Yes, prepare the wax tablets and stylus," I replied. "Tonight I shall record some observations about the proper handling of educated slaves and the detection of overseer corruption." As Gaius efficiently arranged my writing materials, I considered the various audiences who might eventually read my agricultural manual. Wealthy Romans, seeking to establish rural estates, would benefit from my practical experience in land management and slave supervision. Sons of established land-owning families could learn the disciplines necessary to maintain inherited properties. Even future generations, living in circumstances I could scarcely imagine, would find value in understanding the principles that had made Roman agriculture the foundation of Mediterranean civilization. The wax tablet beneath my stylus seemed to invite the crystallization of decades of accumulated wisdom. I began to write, my hand moving with the practiced fluidity of someone accustomed to transforming thoughts into written words. The wise landowner must understand that slaves, like horses or oxen, require different management techniques depending upon their nature and capabilities. The strong-backed laborer needs firm discipline and adequate nutrition. The skilled craftsman responds to incentives and the promise of eventual manumission. The educated Greek requires careful handling to extract maximum value while preventing the spread of corrupting foreign ideas. The scratching of my stylus against the wax provided a soothing rhythm as I continued my observations. When detecting corruption among overseers, the prudent master looks not only at financial records, but also at the condition of valuable slaves. A brutalized teacher or damaged craftsman often reveals theft more clearly than missing coins, for the dishonest overseer seeks to conceal his crimes through violence rather than accountability. The evening progressed as I filled tablet after tablet with detailed observations about estate management, slave psychology, and the economic principles that govern successful agricultural enterprises. Each insight had been paid for through experience, sometimes bitter experience, as with the Rufus affair, and represented knowledge that could save future landowners from costly mistakes. My thoughts turned to the political implications of proper estate management. A senator's credibility in debates about military funding or public works depended partly upon his reputation for successful administration of his private affairs. Colleagues who had squandered inherited wealth through poor management found their opinions discounted in discussions of public finance. Those who had increased their family holdings through wise investment and careful supervision commanded respect that transcended party affiliations. The slave children whom Xanthus would now educate represented an investment in Rome's future as much as my own. These young people, trained in Greek language and Roman discipline, would eventually serve in households throughout the empire. Some might become teachers themselves, passing on their knowledge to yet another generation. Others might serve as skilled administrators, scribes, or artisans whose capabilities would contribute to the complex economy that sustained Roman civilization. As the night deepened and the oil in my lamps burned lower, I found myself returning again and again to the fundamental question that had driven my entire career. How could Rome maintain the values that had created its greatness while adapting to the challenges of governing a diverse and far-flung empire? The answer, I believed, lay in the unwavering application of proven principles. tempered by the practical wisdom that came from direct experience in managing complex enterprises. The villa episode had reinforced my conviction that success, whether in agriculture, politics, or military affairs, depended upon personal involvement rather than delegation to subordinates. The master who relied entirely upon reports from overseers would inevitably discover that reality diverged significantly from documentation. Only through direct observation, unexpected visits, and the willingness to descend into the ergastulum when necessary could one maintain the standards that separated prosperity from decline. My agricultural treatise would preserve these lessons for posterity, but more importantly, it would serve as a statement of philosophical principles that transcended the specific techniques of farming or slave management. Future readers would learn that the same qualities that made for successful estate administration, attention to detail, firm but fair discipline, long-term thinking, and personal integrity were essential for success in any endeavor that served the Roman Republic. The final entry in my evening's work addressed the question that had troubled me throughout the day. The landowner must remember that his estate serves not merely his personal enrichment, but the greater good of Rome itself. Every grain of wheat properly cultivated helps feed the urban population. Every olive tree carefully tended produces oil for lamps and commerce. Every slave wisely managed contributes to the human resources that maintain our civilization. The corruption of an overseer therefore represents not just theft from his master, but betrayal of the republic itself. As I set aside my stylus and prepared for sleep, I felt the satisfaction that comes from a day well spent in service to both personal and public duty. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in the Senate, where the lessons learned at my villa would inform my contributions to debates about governance and policy. The integration of private experience with public responsibility had been the guiding principle of my entire career, and it would continue to shape my efforts to preserve Roman greatness for future generations. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. Dawn came early to the Roman household, as it had for centuries before the empire stretched its boundaries to encompass the known world. I rose with the sun, as was my custom, energized by the resolution of the previous day's crisis, and eager to return to the broader challenges that awaited me in the Senate. The events at my villa had reinforced important lessons about leadership and accountability that would prove invaluable in the political battles ahead. My morning routine began with a cold bath, a practice that maintained both physical vigor and mental discipline in an age when luxury and softness threatened to corrupt Roman character. The shock of cold water served as a daily reminder that comfort should be earned through achievement rather than assumed as an entitlement. This simple ritual connected me to the traditions of my ancestors, who had built Rome's greatness through sacrifice and self-discipline, rather than the pursuit of immediate pleasure. Gaius had prepared my toga with the meticulous care that marked his Greek training. The pure white wool, bordered with the narrow purple stripe that indicated senatorial rank, represented more than personal status. It symbolized the responsibility I bore as a guardian of Roman institutions and values. Every fold of the garment reflected the dignity that citizens expected from their elected representatives, and the weight of the fabric served as a constant reminder of the burdens that came with political authority. As I made my way through the morning streets toward the Forum, I observed the daily rhythms that sustained the world's greatest city. Bakers emerged from their shops, carrying fresh loaves for the morning market. Craftsmen opened their workshops to begin another day of productive labor. Slaves hurried through the thoroughfares carrying messages and supplies that kept the complex urban economy functioning efficiently. The diversity of activity reflected the sophistication of a civilization that had successfully integrated conquered peoples and foreign innovations into a uniquely Roman synthesis. The Forum itself buzzed with the energy that had made it the political center of the Mediterranean world. Senators gathered in small groups to discuss pending legislation, their conversations reflecting the wide range of perspectives that complicated governance of a far-flung empire. Some advocated for policies influenced by Greek political theory, others pushed for measures that would benefit their personal commercial interests, and a few, like myself, argued consistently for the preservation of traditional Roman values, influences of wealth and foreign culture. My colleagues greeted me with the respect due to a senior senator whose reputation for integrity had been established through decades of public service. Yet I could sense the underlying tensions that divided the Senate into competing factions. The old guard, composed mainly of men from established Roman families, struggled to maintain traditional approaches to governance against newcomers who brought different perspectives shaped by military service in exotic provinces or commercial ventures in distant markets. The morning's first debate concerned funding for public works projects in recently conquered territories. Proponents argued that Roman-style infrastructure would help integrate new provinces into the empire, creating loyalty through the visible benefits of Roman rule. Opponents worried about the enormous costs involved and questioned whether resources might be better spent on strengthening Italy's agricultural foundations rather than building monuments to Roman power in foreign lands. I rose to address the assembly, my voice carrying the authority that came from practical experience in managing large-scale enterprises. Honored colleagues, before we commit the Republic's treasury to grand projects in distant provinces, we must remember that Rome's strength has always rested upon the solid foundations of Italian agriculture. The estates that feed our urban population and generate the wealth that funds our legions require constant attention and investment. A senator who has never personally managed agricultural workers or calculated the return on investment from olive groves may not appreciate the patient accumulation of resources that makes ambitious public works possible. Speech drew knowing nods from fellow landowners who understood the connection between rural productivity and urban prosperity. The revenues generated by efficiently managed estates like mine provided the tax base that supported not only public construction but also the grain distributions that kept Rome's masses content and the military salaries that maintained order throughout the empire. The debate continued through the morning, touching on broader questions about the future direction of Roman civilization. Should the Republic embrace the cosmopolitan influences that came with territorial expansion? Or should it maintain the cultural unity that had enabled a small Italian city-state to dominate the Mediterranean? Could traditional Roman values survive the wealth and complexity that success had brought? Or would prosperity inevitably lead to the same decadence that had destroyed previous empires? As the session progressed, I found my thoughts returning repeatedly to the lessons learned during my investigation of Rufus's corruption. The same principles that governed successful estate management, personal accountability, careful supervision, and swift correction of problems, applied equally to the governance of an empire. Senators who delegated their responsibilities to subordinates without maintaining oversight would find themselves betrayed, just as surely as landowners who trusted corrupt overseers. The afternoon brought private meetings with fellow senators who sought my advice on various matters. Some requested recommendations for estate management, knowing that my agricultural success provided valuable insights for their own rural investments. Others asked for guidance on political strategy, recognizing that my reputation for integrity gave weight to my endorsements and opposition. During one particularly significant conversation, a younger senator from a recently ennobled family confided his frustration with the complexity of managing inherited properties. Marcus Porcius, I find myself overwhelmed by the details of rural administration. My father acquired these estates through military service, but he had no opportunity to teach me the skills needed to manage them effectively. How does one learn to detect dishonesty in overseers or evaluate the productivity of different agricultural techniques? My response drew directly from the previous day's experiences. The only reliable method is personal involvement. You must visit your properties unexpectedly, examine conditions with your own eyes, and never accept reports at face value. Corruption flourishes in the absence of supervision, while honest management thrives when masters take active interest in their enterprises. The time you invest in learning these skills will return profits far exceeding any temporary inconvenience. The conversation continued as I shared specific techniques for evaluating slave productivity, detecting financial irregularities, and maintaining the delicate balance between discipline and incentive that kept large workforces functioning efficiently. These were lessons that could not be learned from books or theoretical discussions. They required the kind of direct experience that came only through years of patient observation and occasional painful mistakes. As evening approached and the Senate session concluded, I reflected on the continuity that connected all aspects of Roman life. The same qualities that made for successful agriculture: careful planning, attention to detail, willingness to make difficult decisions, were essential for effective governance. The senator who could not manage his private affairs competently was unlikely to contribute meaningfully to public policy debates, while the landowner who understood the challenges of supervising diverse workforces brought valuable insights to discussions of imperial administration. The walk back to my residence provided an opportunity for final contemplation of the day's activities. My agricultural treatise would eventually preserve the practical knowledge I had accumulated through decades of estate management, but more importantly, it would serve as a testament to the values that had made Rome great. Future readers would learn not just how to cultivate crops or manage slaves, but how to maintain the discipline and integrity that distinguished civilization from barbarism. The oil lamps in my study awaited my return to the evening's writing, where I would continue recording the observations that might someday guide other Romans facing similar challenges. The integration of private experience with public responsibility would remain the central theme of both my literary work and my political career, for I believed that the strength of the Republic depended upon citizens who understood the connection between personal excellence and collective achievement. As I settled into my chair and reached for my stylus, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life spent in service to principles larger than personal ambition. The corruption discovered at my villa had been eliminated. The Senate debate had advanced important discussions about imperial policy, and the evening's writing would contribute to the preservation of Roman wisdom for future generations. Each day brought new opportunities to strengthen the foundations upon which our civilization rested, and each responsibility fulfilled brought us closer to ensuring that Roman greatness would endure for centuries to come.